Was it September the 11th in New Zealand? The Christchurch Mosque massacre was the deadliest attack aimed at Muslims in the West. In modern times, as people across the globe mourn, questions remain about why there is such hatred against Muslims and immigrants. Is white nationalism on the rise? Is stricter gun control needed worldwide? And what role should social media play in the wake of the tragedy? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by David MAHON, Executive Chairman of MAHON China Investment Management, and Rick Dunham, Visiting Scholar at Tsinghua University. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. David, New Zealand generally has very low levels of gun violence. Why the different story this time around?
This is almost unprecedented, and I think that it's an individual who has a particular hate of others, Muslims certainly, and it seems that he has a relationship with the Crusades, this idea of hating both Muslims and Jews. So this is a very small part of New Zealand society, but racism exists in all societies, and I think that we have been perhaps somewhat complacent about the rise of small pockets of white nationalism in our country. It's common, though, across the Western world at the moment. The trouble is politicians get away with, in a remote sense, championing these things. We have a Deputy Prime Minister, Winston Peters, for instance, who spoke only a few years in Parliament, saying that after an atrocity in London committed by Muslims, he condemned Islam, and he warned New Zealanders that Muslims were a threat in our country. So these things that are enunciated in the media as well get common people who don't know who Muslims are. They're 1% of our population. They're a most law-abiding, self-governing community. But people are afraid of what they don't understand. And that racism, I think, is something that exists in any society. What happened last week is an aberration in terms of the New Zealand society, but the fact it happened means we have to look deeply and not just say this is not us. But this happened in our country, and it happened by someone, happened to be an Australian by birth, but it appears that his radicalism was nurtured in New Zealand.
50 were killed and 20 more seriously wounded. Rick, do you think white nationalism only targets Muslims, and why there is so much hate against Muslims?
First, white nationalism does not only target Muslims. It targets immigrants in general. In America, a lot of that is Mexican Americans and Central Americans. In Europe, it often is Jews, as well as Muslims. Hate crimes against Jews and Muslims are significantly on the rise in Europe and in America. But this is somewhat radical Christianity, like ISIS was radical Islam, but it focuses mostly on Muslims. Muslims have been the enemy because you've had, quote, the war on terror since 2001, since the September 11th attacks, and you've had U.S. intervention in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Do you think media, particularly social media, that has been heavily influenced by Christian extremism, has demonized the image of Muslims since September the 11th?
I think that's true, Yang Rui, and they're pandering to the assumption of a population, when those that committed the atrocity of 9/11 were they were Muslims. They were from Saudi Arabia, actually. But if you think of the number of atrocities in America, 80% of them are committed by domestic Americans, not even immigrants. And only less than 20% have been committed by people who are not doing it in the name of some kind of white nationalism, white supremacy. We think that we are tolerant. We think we are not anti-Semitic and Islamophobic, because we like to imagine ourselves to be that way. But if we don't speak out against the things that are, what we're allowing to happen is an unconscious fear or an unconscious judgment of others. You talk to Chinese immigrants in my country, and again, New Zealand has a reputation for being very welcoming to Chinese people. That's what New Zealanders tell each other. You need to ask the Chinese immigrants themselves, how does it feel to be the minority? And they say, At times we're marginalised, at times we're judged, at times we're seen as outsiders, when all those that have chosen to live in New Zealand or any country are people of that country. So we need to root out these things that are in the subconscious of our cultures. The trouble with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, it's not just 9/11, it's hundreds and hundreds of years old. It was actually part of the identity of European Christians, my forebears, that their validity was based on the fact that these people were wrong, these people were evil. So it's quite a deep thing. And the way it manifests in this crazy young guy is a thing that can't be seen too much in isolation. Let's look at all the other things that we marginalise in our country. And one thing about New Zealand is that because our Maori people, our Polynesian people, forced us over the last 30, 40 years to recognise the injustices that they had suffered. They forced us to recognise how bicultural we were. And I have Maori on my passport. Maori is a part of most ceremonies. It's expressed in New Zealand. Shows that this has occurred. But they brought it to us and pushed us to recognise that injustice. We tend to be complacent as European New Zealanders that we are uniquely tolerant, when actually, although I think there are some real benefits, there are some real qualities in our culture, we can't be self-satisfied. We can't take it for granted and be complacent. We've got further to go, particularly with immigration from Asia and from the Middle East that's increased in the last 10 years.
My nephew studied in New Zealand as a Chinese returned student, and most of the Chinese I talked to, they got a beautiful impression about New Zealand, not only as a tourist destination, but also as a Western country that is so friendly to the Chinese. Having said this, Rick, how different is New Zealand from most other member states of the Five Eyes Alliance? And I was surprised that the little intelligence reports were shared ahead of the shootings.
Right. Well, I think there's a real problem with white nationalism and white racism and intelligence, because there really is not the same kind of work that's being done by the intelligence agencies on these white nationalists who are radicalized on the internet and social media. There are big files on Islamic terrorists or people are considered terror threats. And this is, almost every one of these cases where there has been white nationalism, a murder committed by a white racist, the authorities say, well, they weren't on any watch list, or we didn't know about them. These people are being radicalized individually on the internet. It's a danger of our social media and our internet, that people can find hate on the internet. And you asked about social media a moment ago. I think that contributes also, because particularly YouTube and Facebook have algorithms to try to keep you on the page. And YouTube, if you look at a hate video, a white racist hate video, will send you other suggested videos that you might want to watch. This is a problem, and YouTube is trying to react after this, but I think they have to be more proactive, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, to try to identify these people and to try to make it harder to spread hate and to read hate on the internet.
Do you guys agree that we got to keep a close eye and should be very watchful about the rise of religious sentiments, particularly sentiments of religious extremism on the social media? People are still awash with bitter memories about anti-Semitic massacre during the Second World War. And the September 11th, the terrorist attacks in the year 2001, we're still recovering from the aftershocks. So let me know your thoughts on the structural reasons behind the rise of white supremacy, David.
I think white supremacy is an expression of white European culture, European origin culture, as the Western world is moving into decline, which it is. And once you have the sense of decline and lose a sense of superiority, which probably for 300 years, generally white Christian people have managed to assume about themselves because they had all the money, they had all the weapons, and they had most of the territory of the world. As this is beginning to change, and other cultures and forces are becoming more predominant, whether it's the flow of influence out of Latin America into the United States, whether it is the fact that half the world's economy, the GDP of the world, is now in Asia. These things have meant that that dominance and power of the West is shrinking. If you look at the issues that Europe faces, these are also traumatic to people whose idea of themselves have been that they're on the top. Their systems are the best. Therefore, they assume they are the best. As this begins to wane and the insecurity in some grows, rather than the recognition that actually the world is now becoming a more just place, we are coming together more by percentage and ratio. The dominance of the past is no longer necessary on anyone's part. But for some, this insecurity means that they will vote for a Donald Trump, who will nurture, who will abet racism, who will, in a strange way, stand by white supremacists. He banned all Muslims, or tried to, as soon as he was elected president. So people who are poorly educated, who feel in the economic injustices of the world often at the bottom of things, they resort and lash out to a philosophy which is centered around being our culture is being taken away unjustly. We must fight for our own rights. And it becomes something quite vicious. When you add a religious momentum behind it, as you've identified, where you are right and everyone else is wrong, and in Christianity, frankly, if you are Jewish or Muslim, you are not considered genuine spiritually. If you are a Muslim, you look upon Jews and you look upon Christians as being one of you. You're people of the book. You come from the same origins. But the white supremacists don't take that view, and therefore they lash out. But these are primitive Neanderthal people. They're subhuman in some ways.
Anything to add, Rick?
Yes. First, I think every religion has extremists. You see it in Israel and Palestine. You see it, obviously, with the Muslim extremists who have killed in Iran, killed in Iraq, killed in Lebanon, and terror attacks in Europe and America. But I think that when we were talking about the rise of these attacks, we have to think of two factors. One is the triumph of populism and the legitimizing, the empowering of people who always have been haters, but who had been afraid to express it publicly. Donald Trump's victory, his refusal to attack criticize the neo-Nazis after the Charlottesville killing, even in this case in New Zealand, of saying, no, it wasn't white nationalism, it was just one very disturbed person, empowers. The second is that social media and the internet allow them to communicate with a like-minded community safely, and a lot of the anger, a lot of the radicalization comes from that. The grandmother of this killer in New Zealand was saying that largely was responsible, that and his travels to the former Yugoslavia, where he developed a deep, deep hatred of Muslims.
Given the uniqueness of the Chinese political institutions in the wake of the Cold War, China has made some controversial decisions, such as very tight control on the social media. And of course, we've made a very wise decision about the gun control in China, despite the possession of illegal firearms in the society at large. So the issue, by the end of the day, when you look at, say, the anger of President Emmanuel Macron and the demonstrations by yellow vest demonstrators, so the control of social media becomes a hot topic, very controversial for Western democracies. China drew a lot of fire for tight control on the social media, but hate is spread through the abusive use of social media. What should we do about this preventive measure that should have been done by the government? But in the West, I believe this will draw more criticism from the lawmaking bodies than in a country like China.
Well, if you think of the great social media platforms such as Facebook, and you think of the scale of these companies, the biggest issue is profit. Essentially, as long as these are unbridled monopolies, they produce huge amounts of profit. We all wish they'd pay more taxes, but they're a very profitable business, and on stock markets, they serve people who invest very well. So the lobbies to not curtail them come from those that are afraid of losing the money one makes from having these sprawling, spontaneous, almost reinventing and perpetuating systems. But there is no excuse for the fact that they do spread hate. And they should they should take responsibility for being conduits for those kind of messages. And as much as governments should respect free speech but punish those that incite others to harm other people, or those that perpetuate hate by giving clearly false views of other people's religions and cultures, then we have to look at social media far more closely. It's not enough to say that it's an issue of freedom of speech. We're basically following a profit motive driven flexibility when we should be considering society. So it's like pornography. In the end, these things, these portals must be closed. They are bad in every way for society.
It's not just the questionable and abusive use of social media that has created dangers and social instability, but also a controversial publication like Charlie Hebdo in France that drew anger from Muslims in that country. Hence the tragedy. So what can be done to maintain the balance between freedom of speech and prohibiting hate and hate campaign through the media?
I would never blame Charlie Hebdo for, blame the victim for the massacre there. Yes, they were out there. They were satirical and very, very critical. But there are a lot of Americans who are satirical and very critical of Donald Trump. And
but Donald Trump is not a religious leader. Prophet Muhammad is a religious leader, and therefore any attempt to humiliate or demonize the religious leader would, of course, draw strong rebound of religious sentiments.
That is correct, but that doesn't justify mass murder the same way.
No.
There's artwork in the United States that's considered very anti-Christian, and it doesn't mean that you would go and you would kill the artist. So I think what we have to do is figure out what are the limits on free speech. And when it comes to this white supremacy, there are limits on hate speech, on inciting violence. I think the problem is enforcement. It's a dual problem. It's the companies self-regulating. They are not doing a good job, particularly Facebook, and being proactive. It will take a lot more money for them to monitor and take down all of this before the hate, not after somebody live streams a mass murder, and then you take it down after. The second is the government. You do have to figure out how, in this publicly available information, Facebook is public, Twitter is public, YouTube is public, if you see hate speech, that you do something about it, that these people go on terrorist watch lists, rather than after the fact you just say, well, they're lone wolves and we can't do anything about it. So I think both have to be done at the same time, and it can be done within the American system of having a First Amendment of freedom of speech. There is not freedom for hate speech.
And in battle, the U.S. government must be still licking the wounds since after the September 11th terrorist attacks, Homeland Security and all other government agencies must have kept a close eye on the rise of far-right movement and those anti-Muslim sentiments in the United States, and the same should be done in other parts of the world to make sure that we are safe and free from fears. You are watching Dialogue with David MAHON and Rick Dunham. We're discussing impact of the Christchurch massacre that targets, obviously, Muslims. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. David, let's go back to New Zealand, your homeland. It's not only an issue in New Zealand and the US. According to CBS, far-right attacks in Europe jumped 43% between 2016 and 2017. Do you think this is one of the hallmarks in the wake of the Cold War? With the end of the hostility between the two arch rivals, the former Soviet Union and the United States, there is this strong rebound of extremism and sentiments of religious extremism. That reminds me of what happened during the official visit by Saudi Crown Prince Salman. This young leader of Saudi Arabia surprised the rest of the world with his stout support of a fight against religious extremism. And that was written into a kind of a joint statement between the Chinese authorities and the Saudi government. Despite demonstrations in Turkey, and you know what the demonstration actually mean for China and for the bilateral relationship between Ankara and Beijing. So what can be done, for example, for responsible stakeholders of the international society to join hand in minimizing the negative impact of either religious extremism or whatever sentiments of extremism.
I think we've discussed...
when the United States vows to decouple the Chinese economy and to work in parallel.
I think we've talked about some of the tools that people use, or maybe even unconsciously are applied to fuel extremism and support it. I think when it comes to what politicians can do, or we must do ourselves in our own societies, it's about actually trying to understand the other, whoever the other is, particularly if they're immigrants. And there are, of course, huge numbers, more than ever since the Second World War, of refugees now moving around the world. Must note, though, that actually Islamic terrorism in Europe and the United States, or against the United States, given the scale of how the Middle East has been broken by the West, in its own fear of losing access and management of oil supplies, is quite extraordinary. I mean, who are the terrorists? 300,000 dead in Iraq. Who were they? That was the American, British, Australian alliance. What do we say about that? The drone strikes that were used in great number under both Bush and Obama. That's a form of terrorism. What happened in Christchurch is like a drone strike on a gathering in Afghanistan in some ways. Now they would say we were fighting against the people who were going to hurt us. But anybody that condones violence in the manner in which the West has, almost by a state mandate, allowed to quite randomly and almost illegally, often illegally, to incur, terrorism can be also a state activity. So I think we have to be very, very careful and think, what are the root causes here? The root causes can be very much economic. I think what's going on in Europe is the sliding back of the society, the reduction of the economy in a less stable world, is hurting a lot of people at the bottom. That radicalizes them.
The problems that we see today, concerning the rise of far-right movement or white nationalism, not just has the bearing on control on energy supply from the Middle East, as you said earlier, David. I'm afraid there's also deep-rooted issues such as the Arab-Israeli conflicts. Look at the future and position of Jerusalem, a future of refugees in their millions since the 4 Middle East wars, and also a border between Israel and the Palestinians since the 1967 war. So these issues have all contributed to the rise of extreme sentiments on the Arab side, despite proxy wars between Sunnis and Shiites in Yemen and Syria. But that's a different story. Rick,
but just with all due respect, you've identified something there in terms of Islamic extremism. That is what is being said in the West. Because of that, somehow we understand white supremacy, because they're being pushed by these actions. If we go back, as you said, to talk about New Zealand. In New Zealand, there is not a lot of, there is 1% of the population is Muslim. Most New Zealanders don't even know that they're there, as they don't even know we have a Jewish population. They live discreetly, they live somewhat within their own cultures or in our society. So any suggestion that what happened in New Zealand has some kind of, or white supremacy has some cause because of the actions of Islam, or Hindu fundamentalism that has risen in India in recent years, I think is something we've got to be very careful of. We should look at our own racism, our own fear of strangers, and our own violence in our own societies. And I was talking about the violence of states. And anyone that makes war in the way, with all due respect, America has made in the last 10 years or so, must look at that as being a form of terrorism. But I think we all have in our own societies enough people that are civilized, educated and reasonable. If they speak out, if they work together, that is the most powerful thing to actually mitigate these things.
Ultranationalism or racism do exist in many countries, regardless of the official ideology, political systems or rule of law there. But let's go back to the fundamental issue of how dangerous it will be when those who possess firearms happen to be white supremacists, or those who stand for white nationalism. What would happen in the future
Well, I think this is why there's a particular threat inside the United States. Because of all countries in the world, the United States has more guns per person and also has some of the most lax gun laws.
Recently in New Zealand is a 144.
Exactly. I mean, New Zealand has among the more liberal gun laws in the world as well, but it doesn't have a history of gun violence. America is the only nation, and I chart this in my multimedia journalism classes, that is near the top of the world in both guns per person and use of guns in murders, use of guns to commit crimes. So I think there's a uniquely American problem. These extremist crimes have gone up 26% in 1 year in the United States, according to NBC News. And so you are having a cause and effect. Now, Donald Trump would argue it's not the guns, it's the people. But without the guns, take the case of China, which is an extreme example the other way, it's much harder to commit the crimes. I mean, you would have to do what extremists have done in China with knives or other weapons.
Rick, it's no open secret that National Rifle Association is, among all others, one of the strongest lobby groups or interest groups in the D.C., which says, from perspective of American history, firearms have been used to safeguard the rights of the people in the context of Bill of Rights. So do you think gun culture in the United States is more about democracy, freedom of expression, or it's about the capitalism or the commercial impact?
Guns are about power right now in America. I go back to 1969, after Robert Kennedy's assassination a year earlier. There was strict gun control approved in the United States. National Rifle Association, in fact, was in favor of gun control legislation at that time. There was a huge shift in the 1970s to the time when Ronald Reagan became president. I think the biggest obstacle right now to reform of gun laws is the U.S. Supreme Court, because they overruled all past precedent, saying that basically there is a nearly unlimited right of Americans to own weapons. They had an expansive interpretation of the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And I think it will also take lawmakers standing up to the NRA, calling them out, and trying to pass legislation. It will not happen while Donald Trump is president. He will veto it. But if you look at the last election, Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, the owner of Bloomberg News, spent millions of dollars in tight congressional races to fund candidates who were for gun control. In California, 5 of the candidates he supported ousted Republican incumbents. I think this is, if you look in suburbs, in urban areas, there is very strong support for gun control. And there still are some Democrats who are with the NRA, but also you're losing Republicans in those areas who are with the gun lobby. So I think it's a process that will take 5 or 10 years, and then the obstacle is the Supreme Court. If Congress passes restrictions, will the Supreme Court allow them to stand?
Thank you so much. When we look at the military industry in the United States, we go back to political assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and why JFK was assassinated, and why Ronald Reagan narrowly escaped from another assassination attempt. So gun-related violence, indeed, a controversial issue for the United States, and when we examine it in the context of Christchurch in New Zealand, we simply want to be free from fears. That's the most basic and the most fundamental human demand. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.